Well, thanks so much for having me. This is effectively the end of my book tour. My book launched 3 months ago in New York, and every week I've been somewhere. Next week is spring break. I'm looking forward to taking my older sons to Arizona, see the Grand Canyon. I've just put in a plug. I hope it goes well, but I was highly recommended this little place called Williams, Arizona, that has an old-timey hotel and old-timey saloons and kind of a village around it, and then a train depot. And it's kind of like one of those trains from Back to the Future 3, with cops and robbers shooting and stuff. Anyway, that's how it was pitched. I hope it turns out that way, because my boys are going to be very thrilled with that. So this event and a couple other things with Show Me is all that stands between that and spring break. So take that for what you will. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here to discuss these important issues. I think we all recognize that there's a crisis in higher education. Even as WashU law may have ascended to its highest ranking ever in U.S. news, the state of higher education and specifically legal education is in trouble. And this crisis, these problems, were thrust to the fore to the national discourse after October 7th. It's amazing that the heart of anti-Semitism in America lies on campus among the most educated and so-called progressive people in the country. As Bill Ackman, the billionaire donor, businessman, Harvard alum, put it in a revelatory essay that came out the same day that Claudine Gay resigned the presidency of that institution, anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine, a warning about larger issues. It's a leading indicator of underlying pathologies, which in this case means everything from cancel culture to ideological indoctrination, intellectual corruption to moral decay. We've seen a subversion of the core mission of universities to seek truth and create knowledge, and of classical liberal values like free speech, due process, equality under the law. It's been a shift from education to activism. The root cause of all of this is a noxious postmodern ideology that contends that truth is subjective and must be viewed through lenses of race, gender, and other identity categories, according to some privilege hierarchy. Your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed. Erwin Chemerinsky, dean of Berkeley Law, wrote a year and a half ago that as a 70-year-old Jewish man, quote, "Never in my life have I seen or felt the anti-Semitism of the last few weeks." Well, some of us were less surprised, given the anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally anti-Western ideology that has taken root in higher ed. Indeed, some of us have a lived experience with this sort of thing. This polite reception that you're giving me stands in stark contrast from one that I got when I tried to speak at UC Law SF, formerly known as UC Hastings, 3 years ago. The response I got from the students there was basically shut up, cleaned up for polite company. They prevented the event from taking place, chanting and banging like it was an Occupy Wall Street meeting. It was the first time I'd ever been disrupted in more than 1,000 public speaking events, and it's a damning indictment of the state of academia at a time when a toxic cloud has enveloped all of our public discourse. Although the FedSoc chapter there had invited me to discuss the subject of my last book, The Politics of Judicial Nominations. You can pick that up on Amazon as well. It's called Supreme Disorder. And that topic became all the more timely when Justice Breyer announced his retirement. But alas, a heckler's veto prevailed, applying a bad faith lens to a poorly phrased tweet in which I criticized President Biden's nomination criteria. Activists called me a racist misogynist and my expertise illegitimate. Specifically, back in January of 2022, I criticized the president's decision to limit his candidate pool for the Supreme Court by race and sex. I argued that if I were a Democratic president, I'd pick the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, Sri Srinivasan, who happens to be an Indian American immigrant, very well respected, very progressive. He was the best choice, meaning by basic operation of logic, everyone else was less qualified, in my view. So if Biden kept his promise, he would pick what, given Twitter's character limit, I inartfully characterized as a lesser black woman. I later deleted that tweet. I said that's poor communication, but I stuck to my point, and I still do, that Biden should have considered all possible nominees, as 76% of the American people agreed, at least according to a poll by that rabid right-wing outlet, ABC News. I was suspended from my new job at Georgetown Center for the Constitution, which is an important center. As we've learned, the rest of the law school is the center against the Constitution, pending an investigation into whether I had violated any university policies on harassment or anti-discrimination. Maybe I was harassing President Biden, not exactly sure, but anyway, now in San Francisco, the students who shut down my event wanted to hear neither about Biden's selection criteria nor about the confirmation battle to come, now that there was an actual nominee at that point. And they did so in the vilest way possible. I'm not going to quote their language again, but literally getting in my face and blocking access to the lectern. The protesters also castigated their own school for allowing me to speak, and called for diverse student representatives to approve speakers, as well as, of course, mandatory training in critical race theory. Never mind that Hastings, as a public institution, would be violating the First Amendment if it disapproved speakers based on the content of their speech. And never mind that, as one of the deans advised in the few minutes when they weren't chanting and banging, when I went outside to confer with the FedSoc officers, and I said, look, you're paying me to be here for an hour, I'll stand there for an hour. There's a bit of surreality to it as well, because it was still, in California, there was still COVID mania, and so we were all masked and stuff. Probably good, because it didn't show my smirk that I was having at this ridiculous display. But anyway, as the school's chancellor pointed out in an email the next day, disrupting an event to prevent a speaker from being heard is a violation of our code of conduct, which the college will indeed must enforce. But it wasn't enforced, and nobody was disciplined. Now, you'd think that law students would have more of an appreciation for engaging with controversial ideas than undergrads. After all, I hope I'm not letting anything out of the bag here, but you students here, you law students, you're going to be facing a lot tougher challenges in your careers than speakers you don't like. But my experience was no isolated incident, not even for that 1 month, March of '22. The following week, a similar thing happened at Yale, ironically at a panel bringing together lawyers from left and right who agreed on little other than the importance of free speech. Then it happened again at Michigan when students obstructed a debate on Texas's heartbeat bill. And then a year later, 2 years ago now, was the shutdown of Judge Kyle Duncan at Stanford. The only thing these things had in common was that they featured non-progressive speakers. We've gotten to a place where questioning, say, affirmative action or abortion is outside the academic Overton window, the permissible range of expressed policy views. It's all well and good to adopt strong speech policies. By this point, most universities, most law schools have pretty good policies in terms of protecting your expression, your speech, delineating what is speech, what's protest, what's disruption that's not allowed. But it's not enough if administrators aren't willing to stand up to those who demand censorship. Proliferating DEI offices enforce an orthodoxy that stifles intellectual diversity, undermines equal opportunity, and excludes dissenting views. I'll get back to that. For my case, after a 4-month investigation, now imagine that, right? Short tweet, pretty short harassment and anti-discrimination policies, just assign the most junior professor to apply law to facts and you're done in 10 minutes. But no, 4 months it took, and I hired Wilmer Hale, a white shoe DC law firm, very expensive. 4 months investigation, and Georgetown reinstated me. Dean Bill Traynor cleared me on the technicality that I wasn't an employee when I tweeted. So some junior associate looked at a calendar and found a jurisdictional loophole. I celebrated that technical victory, but then I got the fine print in my inbox, the report from the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action, IDEA. And they set me up for discipline the next time that I transgressed progressive orthodoxy. They said that if I ever were to offend someone again, I'd be creating a hostile educational environment. The dean reiterated those concerns, noting the harmful nature of my tweets. Now, after considering that report, consulting with my lawyer, Professor Randy Barnett, who hired me, my wife, who's a better lawyer than any of us, I realized, sadly, that I couldn't do the job that I was hired to do, either inward-facing in terms of teaching and organizing student programs, or outward-facing, writing, speaking, advocating for originalism, that sort of thing. That clearly, in talking about controversial Supreme Court cases, I'd be offending people. So instead of participating in that slow-motion firing, I realized staying in the job was untenable, and I resigned. What Georgetown subjected me to, what it would have subjected me to had I stayed, is, to mix metaphors, a heckler's veto leading to a star chamber. Live not by lies, warned Solzhenitsyn. Let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. That became my mantra. I couldn't live that way, so I made what lawyers call a noisy exit, writing and publicizing a resignation letter showing how Georgetown was violating its own rules and displaying its hypocrisy, and then, of course, as one does, publishing that resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal and announcing my next move to the Manhattan Institute on Fox News. And I've been using this moment that I've been given, this platform that I didn't ask for, to shine a light on the rot in academia. That fall of 2022, when Justice Thomas withdrew from teaching at GW, it was just one more example of the poisonous atmosphere in academia that makes it impossible to have a free exchange of ideas. GW administrators rightly stood up to the mob, demanding that he be canceled for his vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. But the fact that they needed to make that statement showed how they'd failed to instill a culture of open inquiry, truth-seeking. It's a shame that he felt the need to withdraw, and a stark contrast to the celebration going on at the same time at Harvard for Justice Stephen Breyer's return. Now, I'm generally optimistic about America. Like Brett Kavanaugh, I live on the sunrise side of the mountain, and maybe we're past peak woke generally. There's always talk about a vibe shift, right, culturally speaking. But we may have passed the point of no return in terms of the illiberal takeover of higher education. And that's particularly dangerous in law schools, which after all graduate the next generation of gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. And I want to be clear, I do mean illiberal. What I'm arguing, what we're seeing, is not the latest iteration of the decades-old conservative complaint about liberal faculty bias. That's still there, and there's certainly problems in terms of viewpoint and racial discrimination in hiring. But that's different. You know, in fact, the beginning of that liberal takeover of the faculty lounge, the Berkeley hippies, the free speech movement in the 60s, would now be considered by today's woke radicals to be retrograde white supremacists. And we have weak leaders at our academic institutions who placate that illiberal left that now drives campus culture. University officials facilitate and even foment social justice mobs, with everyone else keeping their heads down to keep out of the cancellation crossfire. And that's largely a story of growing bureaucracies. We'll get to ideology if you want to talk about, critical theory and all that. That's certainly a big part of it, but the less sexy part that's probably even more important is the bureaucratic part. The statistics on the growth of these left-skewed, non-teaching staff are mind-boggling. In the quarter century ending 2010, administrative positions swelled by 60%, a rate of growth 10 times that of tenured faculty. The number of university employees who don't teach grew at twice the rate of students, while tuition tripled. Now, uniform statistics across the country for the 15 years since are harder to come by. There's kind of a bait and switch to make such study more difficult, but suffice it to say that growth in bureaucracies has only accelerated and has far outpaced that in faculties or student bodies. These trends are particularly acute in so-called elite places. Yale's administration ballooned by nearly 50% from 2003 to 21, 3 times as fast as the undergraduate student body. At Stanford, the number of administrators grew by 30% from 2017 to 22 alone. So the school now has nearly twice as many non-teaching staff as undergrads, and 6 times the number of administrators as faculty. The joke is that 100 years ago, Yaleys came to campus with their own personal butlers. Well, now we're working up to provide that kind of service to them. But in effect, students and families are paying a lot more to subsidize a class of well-paid bureaucrats. And administrators are even more radical than professors. A 2018 survey found that faculty have a liberal to conservative ratio of about 6-to-1 nationwide. Now, you take away engineering schools, economics departments, business schools, and that gets skewed further. If you only look at the top 50, say, schools in the country, that gets skewed even further. But overall, 6-to-1. While higher ed administrators are about 12-to-1, with 40% self-identifying as far left. What once were technocratic paper pushers enforcing compliance with regulations have morphed into enforcers of racialism and gender ideology. Bureaucrats' incentives, wherever they are, public sector, private sector, nonprofit, is always to justify and expand their own authority and budgets. And that's what's happened here. As apparatchiks with no connection to teaching or research, not steeped in values of academic freedom, due process and things like that, eviscerate due process, free speech, in the name of other things that they've been trained professionally to value. And so, having gained a sense of the overall trends, let's focus on DEI, which, if you just look at dictionary definitions, shouldn't be problematic. Indeed, should be healthy, right? You want people from different backgrounds or viewpoints. That enriches discussion, that prevents groupthink. Equity, the law students and lawyers in the audience, most of you, know that this is a centuries-old concept in Anglo-American law that boils down to the layman to treating people fairly. And who wouldn't want people to feel included, welcome wherever they work or study or what have you. The problem is, as applied by the professional standards of the diversity industrial complex, as I call it, these terms have come to mean the exact opposite of what I've now described as their dictionary definitions. It wasn't until after the Supreme Court's decision in the University of Michigan affirmative action cases in 2003 that universities began having diversity officers in a student-facing position. Before that, there were some kind of number crunchers trying to racially balance and things like this, and admissions offices and otherwise, but it wasn't kind of a public thing. You wouldn't find websites or offices devoted to this sort of thing. And now that has exploded. A 2021 survey of 65 large universities, the old Power 5 football conferences. Now I know there's 2 mega conferences and some other teams floating around, but the old Power 5, 65 universities representing 16% of all students at 4-year institutions found that the average school has more than 45 people devoted to DEI, more than the average number of history professors. At the University of Michigan, for example, which 2 weeks ago announced they were closing their DEI office, we'll see whether there or elsewhere, it's just a change of titles and people being shifted around and websites taken down, but the same programs and structures kept. We'll see. But anyway, at this count, Michigan had 261 full-time people with authority over DEI programming, double that if you count part-timers, at a cost of more than $30 million. Now, if your concern is helping underprivileged students, imagine spending that money on scholarships or tutoring services or other kinds of support. But anyway, DEI is, or at least until January, was the fastest growing element of educational bureaucracy, with staffs on average 4 times larger than those that provide legally required accommodations for students with disabilities. And all of these counts, by the way, exclude lawyers, compliance officers, and their staff that deal with Title IX, equal employment opportunity, and other federal and state civil rights laws. So this has nothing to do with enforcing the law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or anything else. An inordinate number of DEI offices have been created or filled in the last decade, especially since the racial reckoning set off by the murder of George Floyd. And the bitter irony is that they fail on their own terms. Set aside the financial issues for a moment. Campus climate surveys find that student feelings of belonging on campus generally, or comfort with racial diversity specifically, is inversely correlated with the size and budgets of these DEI offices. And so the real danger is that universities no longer focus on free inquiry in pursuit of knowledge. Instead, they deploy an army of non-teaching educrats that either distracts from that mission by providing therapeutic coddling or actively prevents truth-seeking by enforcing an ideological orthodoxy that balkanizes the campus. Having staff organize students' lives and hold their hands while processing the traumas of election results they don't like infantilizes the young adults that should be preparing for the workplace and the public square. Having staff organize trainings, rallies, and struggle sessions centered on narrow perspectives on race, sex, class, and other categories prevents the development of critical thinking skills that students need to become well-adjusted professionals. It also shifts power away from faculty, whatever problems there are with the faculty, and there are plenty, and gives it to political commissars whose goals diverge from long-held higher ed values. DEI offices have broadened terms like harassment and discrimination, as well as therapeutic terms like harm and safety, not to promote equal opportunity or a welcoming campus environment, but to enforce progressive ideology. The behavior of Stanford's DEI dean in egging on the mob against Judge Duncan was illustrative of how these regimes are antithetical to universities' basic missions. For those who have forgotten or didn't follow that escapade, Dean Tyrion Steinbeck there came up with 6 minutes of prepared remarks that boiled down to, is the juice worth the squeeze? That is, this federal judge, one of the leading intellectual jurists in the country, was there to give a talk about judging during uncertainty. COVID, guns, all of these big issues on which the Supreme Court had not pronounced, how do lower courts deal with that? It was precisely the kind of nerdy subject that you come to schools like Stanford or WashU to hear from leading practitioners, judges, scholars about. And so what Dean Steinbach was saying was that juice was not worth the squeeze of the implicit harm from him being in that room. What was the harm from him being in that room? Well, as a lawyer, he had clients who were politically incorrect. As a scholar, he had written articles that some people don't like. As a judge, he had written things that some people didn't agree with. Now, if they felt that harm, I don't know why they needed to be in that room with them. If I felt that way, I probably would have absented myself to prevent discomfort or what have you. But anyway, this was the dean instantiating the highest values of her discipline. And so there's been this shift from education to indoctrination. When I was in law school, which sometimes feels like it was yesterday and sometimes feels it was on another planet a long, long time ago, it was the early 2000s, critical legal studies with its Hegelian and culturally Marxist discourse was a spent force. We had heard about it, but it was something from the 80s and 90s that had been relegated back to a box and put in some niche corner of the sociology department. No real practical application. But now the crits are back, and not just in sociology or comparative literature. Regardless of what's going on in K-12 or undergraduate teaching, Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw have eclipsed William Blackstone and Louis Brandeis as avatars of legal education. And that shift, when coupled with the bureaucratic growth, has led institutions to prioritize activism over inquiry, seeking social justice rather than truth. In the very real context in law schools, which need to be training lawyers to see all sides of a particular issue so you can better advocate for your client, the theory is, well, half of those perspectives are simply illegitimate and you can't talk about them. Or, for example, it's less of a problem that there might be no originalists teaching constitutional law at a given law school, but if nobody's actually teaching originalism and how it works, then you're doing students a disservice because the majority of the Supreme Court and half the federal judiciary want to see that kind of advocacy. So just very nuts and bolts, quite apart from who's right, who's wrong on the merits of a legal issue or what interpretive theory is the best. Law schools, given their ideological myopia, are failing to give their students what they need to be effective lawyers. So I'm pessimistic that anything will change at any school where academic freedom isn't supported, where rules against hecklers' vetoes, takeovers of academic buildings, encampments that block student access aren't followed. Too few administrators followed the example of the late University of Chicago president Bob Zimmer, who, in response to punish Professor Dorian Abbott for questioning the school's affirmative action policies, said, no, faculty have full freedom to disagree with university policy and make statements, what have you. You don't like it? Write an op-ed in the school paper, have a protest, do a blog post, but don't look to me to police speech. Too few follow the lead of Vanderbilt Chancellor Daniel Diermeier, who ejected and expelled students who had taken over his office last year. I mean, it's a pretty low bar, enforcing the actual policies that you already have. But it's observed in the breach. So when someone like Diermeier does this, it makes national news. He gets plaudits. Wherever leaders stand up for the core mission of any academic institution, the mob disperses. This is what gives me some cautious hope that in so many places these structures and systems are, to mix metaphors again, like Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. But most presidents and deans, and apologies to any who might be in the room here, most nationwide are spineless cowards. They're not woke radicals. That is not my point. They're careerists who have been successful in climbing that greasy bureaucratic pole, responding to the matrix of incentives that they face, cost benefits, and they're unwilling, have been unwilling, to confront the illiberal inmates who have taken over their institutions. Statements about academic freedom, declining to fire Supreme Court justices, that's simply not enough. Educational leaders have to instill a culture of respect for opposing views and model civil discourse and enforce policies against disruptions of educational programs. That means dismantling DEI bureaucracies that undermine classical liberal values, ending loyalty oaths and ideological litmus tests in the form of diversity statements. Presidents and deans are really good at instilling whatever values they care about, be that public service, social justice, entrepreneurship, whatever. They can and should do that for open inquiry and civil discourse. Concretely, they shouldn't rely on the Federalist Society to bring in the only speakers that will give a different perspective from what students are getting in class. Now, when I left Georgetown, we're coming up on 3 years since that, I wasn't holding my breath at the prospect of reform. But maybe now we're finally seeing a backlash to our illiberal inquisitors. Now, I'm still not sure it can all be done from within. So we need external controls from state legislators and attorneys general. Congressional oversight, right? We saw the success of the hearings in the House Education Committee, bringing waves of university presidents up to testify. Now we have the administration investigating, pausing funds, pulling on those federal strings that have always been there on funds, to, strings that include everything from maintaining accounting standards to enforcing civil rights laws, anti-discrimination rules, student free speech. There are lots of strings there, and universities have been getting away with not fulfilling their end of the bargain for too long. So now they're paying the piper, it looks like. And we also need what economists call exogenous shocks, like the boycott of Yale and Stanford and Columbia for clerk hiring by 14 or 16 judges, depending on the school, plus employers shying away from hiring those who support Hamas or who shout at federal judges that they hope their daughters are raped. And we need public exposure. 2 years ago, my now colleague, John Saylor, an investigative reporter, he started using FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, to get documents from public schools about various practices. And 2 years ago, he's now done this several times, but the first one involved Texas Tech, showing how they were using diversity statements as the primary criterion for hiring economics and biology professors. The very next day, after this one op-ed, the chancellor of Texas Tech announced that that's not appropriate, we're not going to do it again. And that's happened again and again. John's work is just really good. It's just public exposure, something that is indefensible. As we've learned, educational leaders, it's not that they're immoral, but they're amoral, and they really don't like bad PR. Heather Gerken, Dean of Yale Law, as well, who wants to be an Ivy League professor, an Ivy League president, and so she's seen all the black eyes that Yale Law got over the years, and realized she needed to do something about it. Not because she's had a come to Jesus moment about classical liberal values or the importance of free speech, but because the incentive structure changed for her. That's fine. That's how you get change. Claudine Gay, Harvard's former president, crystallizes the larger problem. Gay is a mediocre academic who was elevated for advancing progressive orthodoxy while checking intersectional boxes. She's the apotheosis of an anti-intellectual movement that values DEI, identity, and activism over truth-seeking, merit, and education. And that movement is designed to prefer commissars over scholars. But her resignation doesn't end that university's troubles. Any of these presidents' resignations that we've seen doesn't fix, Penn or Columbia or what have you. I mean, Columbia's on, they seem to switch presidents every 6 months. It reminds me of that old joke about French constitutions being filed in the periodical section, right? Something like that. We'll see if one of these presidents can actually get this right. And it's not rocket science. We are not facing unprecedented public policy problems for which we need to theorize new solutions. The solutions are right there. It's not even a matter of having bad policies. It's enforcing the policies that you actually have. And so even with the president's removal or change, Harvard or any of these other schools that have been shamed is plagued by a toxic campus culture, bureaucratic bloat, ideological corruption that stifle open inquiry and free discourse. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, one of my favorite organizations in the country, it's kind of taken up the mantle from the ACLU to become the lead defender of free speech and expression, recently named Harvard the worst school in the country for free speech for the second straight year. I think it was the only one that got a negative score. Well, Harvard may be the worst on that and other measures, but it's by no means alone. It doesn't take long to destroy reputations built over decades and centuries. The question now is whether higher education grandees are willing to do the work to restore their tarnished stature. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and knowledge, and law schools return to their goal of teaching lawyers to respect the rule of law. But the battle's been joined. Thanks very much. I look forward to answering or dodging your questions. And I know there's a 1L who's dying to ask the first question. Go ahead. Well, my point is about more than just speech, and the incidents that make the news, that are kind of above the waterline, aren't the whole deal. So it's not just speakers being shouted down or professors being suspended based on complaints by students about hate speech or something like that. As far as speech is concerned, it's not that hard. There's certain things that aren't speech. If you beat somebody up because you don't like their political views, you don't have a First Amendment defense of that. The most colorful example of that I've come across recently was somebody urinated on a Hillel building, like a Jewish student building, and wanted a First Amendment defense both for political and artistic expression. You know, sorry, you don't get that. Then there's speech that's not protected, pretty high bar for things like incitement of violence, for example. But then there's other things like harassment or intimidation, and there's plenty of case law about what that means. So giving a speech in the middle of a public square that's, you know, bigoted and hateful and things like that probably is protected. But if you direct that speech at a particular person, then that starts becoming harassment or intimidation or what have you. Or if you end that speech with, and therefore any Jew you meet today, punch them in the face. That crosses the line. And then you have what most of the discussion is, which is time, place, and manner restrictions. So even core political speech that's clearly protected in certain situations is not appropriate. Like if I go to your neighborhood, wherever you live in the middle of the night, and with a bullhorn start telling you what I think about Donald Trump. No, that's disturbing the peace. Or, you know, I take over a street to make whatever point I want to make. Similarly on campus, you can have a protest, but not if that protest disrupts a class or disrupts, you know, an event like this where a student organization has duly reserved the room and things like that. So just, you know, all schools have rules making clear, delineating these sorts of things. You know, there are other issues that come up. Extramural speech. There's been, Keith Whittington has done, I think his last book was mostly about this. He's recently been hired from Princeton by Yale Law to do free speech stuff. He heads up the Academic Freedom Alliance. So there are protections for extramural speech that don't exist for intramural speech, for professors, things, you know. If you're teaching a math class and all of a sudden you start giving your theory of the Civil War, not appropriate, you know, even though it would be appropriate if you want to write a blog post outside of school or something like that. So, you know, it's, you know, the rules surrounding speech are pretty clear. Now, I mean, you start asking about ICE and things, that gets into immigration regulations, and I'm happy to talk about that. I've been looking into that and talking to the media about how all that works. Not really a school speech issue. It's in general what makes you eligible and ineligible for a visa, and what makes you ineligible on the front end if you're applying from a foreign country is the same thing that makes you ineligible when you're in the country. So including sometimes speech, like if you wanted to make a speech saying that you were supporting the violent overthrow of the US government, that disqualifies you from a visa. That'll get your visa pulled here, even though it's pure speech. Now, what all of these students, it looks like, are getting in trouble for is actually participating in action and protests and you know, disruptions and various things. But you know, that's an issue. We don't want to import people who you know, are a cancer on our body politic. And every country in the world has rules about who can and can't come in and things like that. Yep. Yeah, that's probably the biggest example of overreach that there is. One of the few examples under the Trump administration, despite all the hemming and hawing and what have you. Yeah, that's petty. It's retribution. It's you know, I don't have much sympathy for these law firms because you know, they would never. Anyway, they have. Wilmer hired Paul Clement, who was fired by two big firms for winning Supreme Court cases on issues that were politically incorrect. So, you know, I'm not going to spend much time defending them. They've made their bed, and now they made themselves targets for that. But yeah, I wouldn't have done those kinds of moves, and that's that is fighting fire with fire rather than kind of principled speech protections. Yep. Well, on the one hand, if the shoe fits, On the other, I'm trying to entertain as well as enlighten, and keep law students awake when I'm giving these presentations. When educational leaders, when deans are too cowardly to enforce their own rules because they don't want to cross the DEI office at their own school and be subject to the same kind of cancellation campaign, sometimes evocative, strong language is needed to, given the seriousness of the problem, because I sincerely feel, and this is reflected in the historically low public confidence in higher education institutions that we now have. And I've been in rooms where I don't know if the dean of, like the head dean of WashU is here, but I've been in rooms with the head dean and things, and they've come up to me afterwards, and the message is sort of like, tough but fair, and we're trying to change our policies. What you described might be some other institutions, but I'm trying, anyway. I think the point is taken, and I'm not trying to be needlessly inflammatory, but certainly, talk about anti-intellectual. I mean, Claudine Gay's work is certainly non-intellectual. So, it really is. I'm calling a spade, and I think that's what's needed in this moment, because we're past the point in higher ed where kind of like tweaking around the margins is all that's needed.
One more question.
Just one more question. Okay, I don't know. Right here.
I have time for like two more.
Okay, two more. All right. I don't think October 7th changed universities. I think it kind of activated certain latent illiberalism, the kind of the foreign policy correlate to the postmodern theories, to critical theory, the post-colonial theories, and all of these sort of things. What it did, though, what this period has done is elevate all of these pathologies into the national discourse. Before, when I would talk about these things, or in kind of in the immediate aftermath of Georgetown, my experience at Georgetown, it was seen as, okay, well, you're a higher ed expert, that's very interesting, but let's talk about, broader national things. And then it became part of the presidential campaign, what's going on campus, things like that. So it's not that it's not that it changed universities or radicalized them or some populations within them, but it did elevate the issue. Luckily, my oldest, I'm the father of 4, the oldest is 9, so we don't face that decision anytime soon, thankfully. But what we're seeing in the real world is, even though most of higher ed doesn't really, there's no market mechanism, there is a little bit of that in that, for example, applications to northeastern schools are down, applications to southeastern schools are up. Harvard is, I think, down 5% in donations, 5% in applications, which you're thinking, well, that's nothing. Plus, they have $60 billion. Well, yeah, $60 billion buys you a lot of cushion. But still, they don't want that to be a trend, as not just the totals that are being donated, but if alumni rates of giving decline, that's, that can become dangerous. That can compound over time, as the finance bros will tell you. So, while for some people the Teal Fellowship, right, becoming an entrepreneur at 18 or 19 might make sense, higher education training I think is still necessary for most people who want jobs that require that. Now, there's a problem that we're basically telling everyone to go to college even for jobs that don't require it, and then requiring licensure with a college degree for jobs. Anyway, that's a separate discussion. But right now I would advise people, my friends who have kids of college age. I can't believe I'm old enough to have friends with kids of college age, but honors colleges of SEC schools, for example, are really good. And the funny thing is, you have these surveys that say if you can get into the so-called most prestigious, Ivy League, Ivy Plus, what have you, then you're going to be great regardless of where you actually end up going. So the really talented folks, You know, I call it the problem of the cold and the scolds, right? Why go somewhere where the weather's bad and you're going to get tongue lashed for using the wrong pronouns, where instead you can, you know, go someplace to have a better time, go to some football games, you might learn something while you're at it.
We actually have time for one more.
Oh, one more. All right, right there. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to comment about any one particular case. The government doesn't reveal all the information it has. I would hope that it's, you know, going after the lowest hanging fruit, you know, the people that are most violating the laws, that are, you know, least desirable to have in the country, things like that. But you know, when I immigrated, when I had a student visa, I had a working visa, then I applied for a green card. I had to certify lots of times that I'm not a Nazi, I'm not a communist, I don't support an authoritarian party, I don't believe in terrorism, I don't want to have a violent overthrow of the government. All of these things that are idea-based, about which you can give a speech that would demonstrate your violation. So yeah, mere speech can be a violation, or can render you ineligible for a visa, which is the same standard of making you removable or your visa revocable on the back end. Again, I would hope that the administration is going after people who are actually part of these violent demonstrations, rather than, you know, all they did was, you know, post a Facebook post. But as we saw, I think just this week it was announced that there'd be screening for evidence of anti-Semitism on social media, you know, and I think it's perfectly fine to have the same standards for granting a visa in the first place as revoking it on the back end, and that's a tough issue. But again, you know, being in America is a privilege, not a right, and every country has the right to screen immigrants for, you know, what it feels are desirable and undesirable characteristics. When we can argue what those characteristics might be, or which ideologies should be excluded. Maybe some of this goes too far, I don't know. But the mere idea of demonstrating yourself to be ineligible or removable, I don't have a problem with that in the abstract. Thanks very much.